Tonight, we're going to step away from the chaos of our everyday world and slip into something softer, something warmer, something that feels like coming home after the longest day imaginable. This isn't just any story. This is a tale about two souls who found each other across impossible odds, lost each other to duty and circumstance, and discovered that some connections transcend even the boundaries of time and space itself. You've probably spent your day rushing from one task to another, your mind spinning with deadlines and obligations, your heart carrying weights you didn't even realize you were holding. Tonight, all of that gets to rest. Tonight, you get to witness a love story that unfolds like a gentle prayer, where healing hands meet healing hearts, and where the most powerful magic isn't found in ancient books or mystical artifacts, but in the simple act of two people choosing each other again and again. So settle deeper into your pillows. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of this story, and allow yourself to be carried away to a place where love conquers not through grand gestures or dramatic proclamations, but through quiet moments, tender touches, and the kind of understanding that only comes when two people have walked through fire and chosen to find their way back to each other. This is the story of Stephen Strange and Christine Palmer, and how sometimes the greatest magic happens not in saving the world, but in learning to save each other. The rain painted gentle patterns against the windows of Christine's apartment, each droplet catching the warm light from inside and transforming it into something that looked almost like tears of joy. She'd always loved rainy nights like this, when the world outside seemed to pause and breathe, when the constant noise of the city softened into something resembling a lullaby. Stephen stood in her doorway, not quite inside, but no longer fully outside, his hands hanging at his sides in that way they did when he wasn't sure if he was welcome. The scars on his fingers caught the lamplight, those marks that told the story of everything he'd sacrificed and everything he'd gained. They were beautiful in their own way, those hands that had learned to heal not just through surgery, but through something far more ancient and mysterious. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," he said, his voice carrying that particular softness it only held when he was being completely honest, when all the walls he'd built around his heart had finally crumbled away. Christine looked at him standing there, this man who'd saved the universe more times than most people knew, who carried the weight of infinite possibilities on his shoulders every single day, and yet somehow managed to look vulnerable and uncertain in her presence. She'd seen him confident, arrogant even, back when his hands were steady and his ego was larger than his heart. She'd also seen him broken, desperate, searching for answers in all the wrong places. But this version of Stephen, the one standing in her doorway with rain in his hair and hope in his eyes, was someone entirely new. "I've been waiting for you," she said simply, stepping aside to let him in, and the relief that washed over his face was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. He stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of rain and something else, something that reminded her of old libraries and distant places, of mysteries solved and worlds saved. She closed the door behind him, shutting out the rest of the world, creating a space that belonged only to them. The apartment was exactly as Stephen remembered it, warm and lived in, filled with the kind of touches that made a house a home. Medical journals stacked on the coffee table, a half-finished crossword puzzle folded beside them, the soft throw blanket she'd had since medical school draped over the back of the couch, photographs scattered here and there, capturing moments of laughter with friends, family gatherings, the life she'd built while he was off learning to bend reality to his will. "Tea," she offered, already moving toward the kitchen, needing something to do with her hands, some normal ritual to ground them both in this moment that felt anything but normal. "Please," he said, following her, his footsteps careful and quiet, as if he was afraid of disturbing something sacred. As Christine filled the kettle and set it on the stove, Stephen found himself studying her profile in the soft kitchen light. She'd changed since he'd last seen her, grown even more beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with the quiet strength that radiated from her very being. There was a peace about her now that he envied, a centeredness that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she stood for. "How do you do it?" he asked suddenly, the question escaping before he could stop it. She turned to face him, eyebrows raised in gentle curiosity. "Do what?" "Stay so grounded, so present. I spend my days jumping between dimensions, seeing infinite possibilities, watching timelines branch and merge and collapse. Sometimes I forget which reality I'm supposed to be living in. But you're always so solidly here, so completely yourself." Christine leaned against the counter, considering his words. The kettle began its quiet whistle, but neither of them moved to tend it. "Maybe that's exactly why we work," she said finally. "You explore all the possibilities out there, and I hold down the fort here. You stretch the boundaries of what's real, and I remind you what's important." Stephen felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. "Is that what we're doing? Working?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with everything they'd never quite managed to say. All the conversations that had been interrupted by emergencies and obligations, and the simple fact that loving someone who belonged to the world as much as he belonged to her was the most complicated thing either of them had ever attempted. Christine reached for the kettle, pouring hot water over tea bags that smelled of chamomile and lavender, herbs chosen for their power to soothe and calm. She handed him a mug, their fingers brushing in the exchange, and even that simple touch sent warmth spreading through both of them. "I think," she said carefully, wrapping her hands around her own mug and letting the steam rise between them, "that we've been trying to fit what we have into boxes that were never designed for us. You're not just a man, Stephen. You're a guardian of reality itself. And I'm not just a woman who fell in love with a surgeon. I'm someone who chose to love a hero with everything that means." They moved to the living room, settling on the couch with a careful distance between them that somehow felt more intimate than if they'd been pressed together. Outside, the rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, creating a cocoon of sound that made the rest of the world feel very far away. "I used to think love was supposed to be simple," Stephen said, staring into his tea as if it might hold answers to questions he'd been afraid to ask. "Two people, one life, predictable patterns, but everything about us has been complicated from the very beginning." Christine tucked her feet underneath her, settling more deeply into the cushions. "Maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe simple love is for simple people, and we've never been simple." Stephen looked at her, then really looked, taking in the way the lamplight caught in her hair, the gentle curve of her smile, the intelligence that sparkled in her eyes. "You make it sound like we're some kind of epic romance." "Aren't we?" she asked, and there was something playful in her voice that made his heart skip. "Think about it, Stephen. We met in a hospital, fell in love over late-night surgeries, and shared ambitions. You lost everything, including me, and went on a journey that literally took you to the ends of the earth and beyond. You became someone completely new, someone with the power to protect entire universes. And now, here you are, sitting in my living room, drinking tea, and trying to figure out if what we had can become what we need. Stephen set down his mug and turned to face her fully. And what do we need? The question was simple, but the answer was anything but. Christine looked at him, this man she'd loved in so many different versions, and felt her heart expand with a certainty that surprised her with its clarity. We need to stop trying to love each other the way other people do, she said. We need to find our own way, one that makes room for magic and medicine, for saving the world and saving each other. We need to accept that our love story isn't going to look like anyone else's, and that's exactly what makes it ours. Stephen reached for her hand, those scarred fingers that had learned to channel energies beyond imagination, intertwining with hers, and the touch felt like coming home and setting out on an adventure, all at the same time. I've seen infinite possibilities, Christine, he said softly. Countless timelines where we never find our way back to each other, where duty keeps us apart, where the weight of responsibility crushes what we have before it can fully bloom. But I've also seen timelines where we figure it out, where we build something beautiful and strange and completely our own. She squeezed his hand, grounding him in this moment, this reality, this choice they were making together. Which timeline do you want to live in? Stephen's answer came without hesitation, spoken with the kind of conviction that could reshape reality itself. The one where I choose you, every single day, in every possible way. The words settled between them like a promise, filling the quiet spaces of the apartment with something that felt both fragile and unbreakable. Christine felt tears she hadn't expected gathering at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally hearing what her heart had been waiting for him to say. Every single day, she repeated softly, testing the weight of the words, the commitment they carried, even when the world needs saving. Stephen's thumb traced gentle circles across her knuckles, a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. Especially then, because what's the point of saving the world if I lose the person who makes it worth saving? The rain outside had softened to barely more than mist, but neither of them noticed. The world beyond these walls had ceased to exist for the moment, reduced to nothing more than the space between them on this couch, the warmth of their joined hands, the quiet conversation that was rebuilding everything they thought they knew about love. Christine shifted closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his eyes, the way his lashes cast shadows on his cheeks in the lamplight. I need you to understand something, Stephen. I'm not asking you to choose between me and your responsibilities. I'm asking you to let me be part of them, to stop protecting me from who you are and start trusting me with all of it. Something in Stephen's expression shifted, a wall he'd been holding up finally crumbling away. You have no idea what you're asking for, he said, but his voice held wonder rather than warning. The things I've seen, the places I've been, the weight of knowing that one wrong choice could unravel everything. Then don't carry it alone anymore, she said simply, bringing her free hand up to cup his cheek, feeling the slight roughness of stubble beneath her palm. I'm a doctor, Stephen. I understand pressure. I understand life and death decisions. I understand what it means to hold someone's entire world in your hands and know that you can't afford to make a mistake. Stephen leaned into her touch, his eyes closing as if he was memorizing the feel of her hand against his face. It's different when the someone is everyone, when the world isn't just one patient, but infinite worlds, infinite versions of everyone you've ever cared about. I know, Christine whispered, and she did know, in the way that love makes understanding possible, even across impossible distances. But you don't have to face that alone anymore. Not if you don't want to. When Stephen opened his eyes again, they were bright with something that looked like hope, mixed with fear, the expression of someone who'd been holding their breath for so long they'd forgotten how to exhale. What if I can't give you the normal life you deserve? What if there are emergencies that take me away for days, weeks? What if there are threats you can't even begin to imagine? Christine smiled, the kind of smile that held years of patience and understanding. Stephen, I fell in love with a neurosurgeon who worked 18-hour days and had an ego the size of Manhattan. You think I don't know how to love someone complicated? You think I need normal? The laugh that escaped him was soft and surprised, carrying away tension he'd been holding in his shoulders for months. When you put it like that. Besides, she continued, settling against his side, fitting perfectly into the space between his arm and his chest, as if she'd been designed to belong there. Maybe normal is overrated. Maybe what we need is extraordinary, something that matches who we've become. Stephen wrapped his arms around her, pulling her closer, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, mixed with something uniquely her. I used to think extraordinary meant lonely, that the price of power was isolation. It doesn't have to be, Christine murmured against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her cheek. Maybe extraordinary means finding someone brave enough to love you exactly as you are. Magic and all, they stayed like that as the last of the rain faded away, holding each other in the soft glow of the living room lamps. Two people who'd traveled impossible distances to find their way back to this moment. Stephen's hands moved slowly up and down her back, a gentle rhythm that seemed to sync with their breathing, with the quiet settling of the apartment around them. Tell me about the timelines where we make it work, Christine said softly, her voice already growing drowsy from the warmth and comfort of being held. Stephen's voice took on the cadence of someone sharing a bedtime story, low and soothing, and filled with images that painted themselves behind closed eyelids. In some of them, you learn just enough about the mystic arts to understand what I do, to help me ground myself when I've been away too long in other dimensions. You become my anchor to this reality. Christine smiled against his chest. What else? In others, I learn to balance better, to trust that the world can survive without me for a few hours while we have dinner, while we take walks in the park, while we build something that's just ours. We find ways to make the extraordinary feel ordinary, and the ordinary feel magical. His voice was growing softer now, the words flowing like water over stones, smooth and continuous and deeply peaceful. Christine felt herself beginning to drift, caught between waking and sleeping, held safe in the arms of someone who'd seen every possible future and chosen the one where they were together. There's one timeline, Stephen continued, his own voice growing heavy with approaching sleep, where we grow old together, where your hair goes silver and my hands finally stop shaking. Not from the accident, but from age, where we sit on a porch somewhere, watching grandchildren play in a garden, and you still roll your eyes when I try to show off with magic tricks. I like that one, Christine whispered, her words barely audible now. So do I, Stephen murmured, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "So do I." The apartment settled into complete quiet around them, the kind of silence that felt full rather than empty, pregnant with possibility rather than loneliness. Two hearts beating in sync, two souls who'd found their way back to each other across impossible odds, choosing rest and peace and the simple miracle of being together. In the morning, there would be decisions to make, conversations to have, details to work out about how to build a life that could accommodate both medicine and magic, both saving individual patients and protecting entire realities. But tonight, there was only this: the weight of Christine's head against Stephen's chest, the gentle rise and fall of their breathing, the promise they'd made to choose each other every single day. Stephen's hand continued its slow movement up and down her back, a meditation in touch that kept him anchored to this moment, this reality, this choice. He thought about all the timelines he'd seen, all the possibilities that branched out like infinite trees from every decision they made. But this one, this quiet night of rain and tea and promises, felt more real than any of them. "Christine," he whispered, so softly he wasn't sure if he wanted her to hear. She responded, already half asleep, but still present enough to answer. "Thank you for waiting for me." Her response came as a sigh that sounded like contentment itself. "Thank you for finding your way back." Outside, the city continued its restless motion, but inside Christine's apartment, time seemed to slow and soften, creating a pocket of peace that felt removed from the demands of both their worlds. Stephen found himself matching his breathing to hers, letting the steady rhythm pull him toward sleep, toward dreams that for once weren't filled with threats and responsibilities, but with simple images of tomorrow mornings and shared coffee and the luxury of waking up next to someone who loved him exactly as he was. This was the magic he'd been searching for all along, he realized as consciousness began to fade. Not the power to reshape reality or peer into infinite futures, but the ability to find perfect contentment in a single moment, in the warmth of another person's trust, in the promise of choosing each other again when the sun rose. The first light of dawn crept through the curtains like a whisper, painting soft golden lines across the walls of Christine's apartment. Stephen stirred first, his body accustomed to early mornings, even when his mind craved rest. But this awakening was different from the countless others that had pulled him from sleep over the years. There was no jarring alarm, no urgent summons from Wong, no mystical crisis demanding immediate attention. Just the gentle warmth of Christine pressed against his side, her breathing still deep and even, her hand resting over his heart as if she'd been keeping it safe while he slept. He didn't move, afraid to disturb this perfect moment, this quiet sanctuary they'd created together. Instead, he let himself study her face in the morning light, tracing with his eyes the features he'd memorized so many times before, but somehow felt like he was seeing for the first time. The way her eyelashes cast tiny shadows on her cheeks, the slight curve of her lips that suggested she was having pleasant dreams, the small freckle just below her left ear that he'd always found endearing. This was what he'd been missing during all those months of interdimensional travel, all those nights spent in the sanctum, surrounded by ancient texts and mystical artifacts. Not just her presence, but the profound peace that came from being completely known and completely accepted by another person. The way she made him feel human again when the weight of cosmic responsibility threatened to strip away everything that made him Stephen Strange, rather than just the sorcerer supreme. Christine's eyes fluttered open slowly, adjusting to the morning light. And when her gaze found his, she smiled with the kind of contentment that made his chest tighten with emotion. "Good morning," she whispered, her voice still soft with sleep. "Good morning," he replied, his own voice rougher than usual, thick with feelings he'd spent too long keeping buried. "How did you sleep?" She stretched languidly against him, like a cat finding the perfect spot of sunshine. "Better than I have in months. You make an excellent pillow, Dr. Strange." The title carried none of its usual formality when she said it like that, warm with affection and gentle teasing. Stephen felt himself smile, a real smile that started somewhere deep in his chest and worked its way up. Years of maintaining perfect posture in the operating room, finally paying dividends. Christine laughed, the sound like music in the quiet apartment. Always the pragmatist, she shifted to prop herself up on her elbow, studying his face with the clinical attention she usually reserved for her patients, but softer, more personal. "You look rested. When's the last time you slept through the entire night?" Stephen considered the question, trying to remember the last time he'd managed more than 3 or 4 hours of uninterrupted sleep. Between monitoring mystical threats and maintaining the barriers between dimensions, rest had become a luxury he could rarely afford. "Honestly, I can't remember." Something flickered across Christine's expression, concern mixed with determination. "That's going to change. Christine, you can't just decide that my responsibilities." She placed a finger gently against his lips, stopping the protest before it could fully form. "I'm not talking about abandoning your responsibilities, Stephen. I'm talking about learning to manage them better. You're no good to anyone if you burn yourself out completely." Stephen captured her hand in his, pressing a kiss to her palm before lowering it to rest against his chest. "It's not that simple. The threats don't follow a schedule. The barriers between dimensions don't respect normal sleeping hours." "No," Christine agreed, settling back against his shoulder. "But you have allies now. Wong manages the sanctum when you're away, doesn't he? Other sorcerers who share the responsibility of protecting reality." "Yes, but nothing. You've spent so long carrying everything alone that you've forgotten how to trust other people to help. That includes me." The words hung in the air between them, gentle but firm, carrying the weight of everything they'd discussed the night before. Stephen found himself thinking about the various timelines he'd seen, the infinite possibilities that branched out from every moment. In how many of those realities had he destroyed what they could have together by refusing to let anyone share the burden he carried? "I'm scared," he admitted quietly, the words escaping before his pride could stop them. "Not of dying, not of failing to save the world. I'm scared of letting you get close enough to see what this life really costs. I'm scared that if you truly understood the weight of it, you'd realize you deserve better." Christine was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing absent patterns against his chest while she considered his words. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of certainty that came from years of making life and death decisions in emergency rooms. "Stephen, I've seen you at your worst. I was there when your hands were destroyed, when your ego crumbled, when you lost everything you thought defined you. I watched you become someone I barely recognized, desperate and angry and completely lost. And I'm still here." She shifted again, turning to face him fully, her eyes serious but warm. "I've also seen you at your best. I've seen you sacrifice everything to save people you've never met, put your life on the line for strangers, carry burdens that would break most people. And I fell in love with you all over again." Stephen felt something ease in his chest, a knot of tension he'd been carrying for so long, he'd forgotten it was there. How do you always know exactly what I need to hear? Because I pay attention, she said simply. Because I love you enough to see past the walls you build to protect yourself. Because I understand that underneath all the magic and responsibility and cosmic significance, you're still just a man who's afraid of being alone. The truth of her words hit him like a physical force. Stripping away pretenses he'd maintained for so long, they'd become second nature. She was right, of course. Beneath the title of Sorcerer Supreme, beneath the power to manipulate reality itself, he was still fundamentally the same person who'd chosen surgery because he needed to feel important, needed to know that his existence mattered in some measurable way. I don't want to be alone anymore, he said, the admission carrying the weight of years of self-imposed isolation. But I also don't know how to be anything else. This responsibility, this power, it changes you. It has to. Or you'd go insane from the scope of it all. Christine reached up to cup his face, her thumb brushing along his cheekbone in a gesture so tender it made his breath catch. Then, we'll figure it out together. You don't have to choose between being the Sorcerer Supreme and being human, Stephen. You just have to learn to be both. The morning light had grown stronger while they talked, filling the apartment with the kind of golden warmth that made everything feel possible. Stephen could hear the city waking up beyond the windows, the distant sounds of traffic and voices that signaled the start of another day. But here, in this bubble of peace they'd created, time felt suspended, elastic, as if the universe itself was giving them permission to simply exist in this moment, without rushing toward whatever came next. What would that look like? He asked, genuinely curious about her vision of their future. This life, where I'm both? Christine smiled, the expression lighting up her entire face. It looks like this, like quiet mornings, where we don't have to rush, like sharing breakfast and reading the paper and having conversations that aren't interrupted by mystical emergencies. It looks like you trusting me enough to tell me when you're struggling, and me being brave enough to ask for what I need from you. She paused, her fingers playing with the fabric of his shirt, a gesture that was both nervous and hopeful. It looks like building something together that's strong enough to survive when duty calls you away, and meaningful enough that you always want to come back. Stephen felt his heart expand with something that might have been hope, bright and warm and terrifying in its intensity. And what about when I have to leave? When there are threats that require the Sorcerer Supreme rather than just Stephen Strange? Then you go, Christine said, without hesitation. You do what you have to do to keep everyone safe, including me, and I'll be here when you get back, ready to help you remember who you are underneath all that power and responsibility. The simplicity of it struck him as revolutionary, not the dramatic choice between love and duty that he'd been wrestling with, but a partnership that made room for both, a relationship built on trust and understanding, rather than ultimatums and sacrifices. You make it sound so straightforward, he said, wonder creeping into his voice. Maybe because it is, Christine replied. We're the ones who've been making it complicated, trying to force it into shapes that don't fit us. What if we stopped fighting what we are and started embracing it instead? Stephen pulled her closer, needing to feel the solid reality of her against him. The warmth that anchored him to this timeline, this possibility, this choice they were making together. I love you, he said, the words carrying everything he'd been too afraid to voice. I love you in ways that span dimensions, in ways that exist across infinite timelines. I love you enough to risk everything, including my own fear. Christine's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face with joy. I love you too, Stephen Strange. All of you. The brilliant surgeon, the powerful sorcerer, the man who's brave enough to save the world, and the one who's brave enough to let himself be saved. They kissed then, soft and slow and full of promises, a seal on the future they were choosing to build together. It tasted like morning coffee and new beginnings, like the kind of magic that didn't require spells or incantations, just two people deciding to trust each other with their whole hearts. When they finally broke apart, Christine rested her forehead against his. Their breathing mingled in the small space between them. "So what happens now?" she asked. Stephen smiled, the expression carrying more peace than he'd felt in years. "Now we get up and make breakfast. Now we figure out how to blend your world and mine. Now we start practicing what it means to choose each other every single day." "That sounds perfect," Christine whispered. But neither of them moved to get up, content to stay wrapped in each other's arms as the morning light grew stronger around them. Outside, the city continued its endless motion. But inside this apartment, time moved at their pace, unhurried and gentle. Stephen found himself thinking about all the mornings that lay ahead of them, all the possibilities that stretched out like an infinite road. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the future felt less like a burden to bear and more like a gift to unwrap slowly, together. This was the real magic, he realized. Not the ability to bend reality or see across dimensions, but the capacity to find profound meaning in simple moments. The way Christine's laugh could chase away the darkness he carried. How her presence could make even the most ordinary morning feel like a miracle. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the apartment in shades of gold and amber, Stephen Strange closed his eyes and let himself drift in the warmth of being completely, utterly, perfectly at peace. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own calls to duty, its own tests of the promises they'd made to each other. But today, this moment, belonged entirely to them. And that, he thought, as sleep began to claim him once more, was the most powerful magic of all. The afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Christine moved around the small space with practiced ease, gathering ingredients for what she'd declared would be their first official meal as whatever they were becoming. Stephen watched from the doorway, marveling at how she could make even the simple act of cooking look like a dance. Each movement, purposeful and graceful. "You know," she said, glancing over her shoulder at him with a smile that made his chest warm. "I always imagined that when you finally mastered the mystic arts, you'd probably just conjure food out of thin air. Very efficient for someone who used to live on hospital cafeteria coffee and energy bars." Stephen laughed, stepping into the kitchen and settling against the counter where he could watch her work. "Believe it or not, Wong tried to teach me that particular skill. Turns out conjured food tastes exactly like you'd expect something made from pure energy to taste, which is to say, like absolutely nothing." Christine paused in her chopping of vegetables, eyebrow raised in curious amusement. "You're telling me that with all the power to reshape reality, nobody's figured out how to make magical food that actually tastes good?" "Oh, they have," Stephen said, reaching over to steal a piece of carrot from her cutting board. "But it requires ingredients from other dimensions, most of which are either highly illegal to import or try to eat you back. The Ancient One once served me tea, made from leaves that grew in a realm where time moves backward. I spent 3 days hiccuping in reverse. The image made Christine dissolve into laughter, the kind that started as a giggle and built into something that had her leaning against the counter for support. "I'm sorry," she managed between breaths, "but the idea of the great Dr. Strange, master of the mystic arts, hiccuping backward for 3 days is possibly the best thing I've ever heard." Stephen found himself grinning, infected by her joy. "Wong still brings it up whenever he wants to humble me. Apparently, reverse hiccups sound exactly like a dying walrus, and I spent most of those 3 days making involuntary walrus noises during very serious mystical consultations." Christine wiped tears from her eyes, still chuckling. "Please tell me someone recorded this. If they did, those recordings are hidden somewhere in the deepest vaults of Kamartaj. And I intend to keep it that way," Stephen said. But his tone was light, playful, in a way it hadn't been for months. There was something liberating about sharing these ridiculous moments with her, about letting her see the absurd underbelly of his mystical existence. "I love this," Christine said softly, her laughter fading into something warmer, more tender. "What? My humiliation?" "No," she said, turning to face him fully, her hands still holding the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir their lunch. "This. You being silly. You letting yourself laugh about the ridiculous parts of your life instead of treating everything like it's life or death." Stephen considered this, realizing she was right. Somewhere along the way, he'd started taking himself so seriously that he'd forgotten how to find humor in the absurd situations his new life regularly presented. It is life or death most of the time, but I suppose that doesn't mean it can't also be ridiculous. Christine stepped closer, reaching up to smooth a strand of hair that had fallen across his forehead. "That's exactly what I mean. You can save the universe and still laugh about hiccuping like a walrus. You can be the sorcerer supreme and still be the man who once tried to perform surgery with shaking hands because his ego was too big to admit he needed help." Her words carried no judgment, only understanding, and Stephen felt something shift inside him, another wall crumbling away. "I used to think that becoming someone with this kind of responsibility, meant leaving behind everything I was before. Like I had to choose between being Stephen Strange, the man, and Stephen Strange, the sorcerer." "Maybe," Christine said, returning to her cooking but keeping her voice gentle, conversational. "The real magic is figuring out how to be both at the same time, how to carry cosmic responsibility without losing your humanity." Stephen watched her work, thinking about the various versions of himself he'd encountered in other dimensions, other timelines. In some, he'd become so consumed by power that he'd lost everything that made him recognizably human. In others, he'd remained so focused on his old life that he'd failed to embrace the responsibility that came with his abilities. But here, in this timeline, with this woman who somehow saw all of him and loved all of him, maybe he could find a balance. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," he said, accepting the wooden spoon she handed him to stir the soup while she added seasonings. "About letting you be part of my responsibilities instead of protecting you from them." Christine's hands stilled for a moment before she continued adding herbs to the pot. And I realized I've been making decisions for you without actually asking what you want. I've been so afraid of losing you to this life that I never gave you the chance to choose it." She turned to face him, her expression serious but not unkind. "What would that choice look like, practically speaking?" Stephen set down the spoon, giving her his full attention. It would mean being honest about the dangers, about the fact that loving me means accepting that I might not come home some nights, that there are threats in this universe and others that would use you to get to me if they knew how much you meant to me. The words hung heavy in the kitchen air, weighted with all the fears he'd been carrying. But Christine didn't flinch, didn't look away. Instead, she nodded slowly, as if she'd already considered these possibilities. It would also mean, Stephen continued, trusting you with the knowledge of what I really do. Not just the sanitized version where I wave my hands and save the day, but the complicated, messy reality of it. The moral gray areas, the impossible choices, the weight of knowing that sometimes there are no good options, only necessary ones. Christine reached for his hands, those scarred fingers that had learned to channel forces beyond imagination, and held them gently in her own. Stephen, I'm a trauma surgeon. I know about impossible choices. I know about the weight of holding someone's life in your hands and having to make split-second decisions that will either save them or lose them forever. She paused, her thumbs tracing gentle circles across his knuckles. The scale might be different, but the principle is the same. You think I don't understand what it means to carry that kind of responsibility, to know that your choices ripple out in ways you can't always predict or control. Stephen felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of tension he'd been carrying for so long. It had become part of him. I never thought about it like that, because you've been so focused on protecting me that you forgot I'm not fragile, Christine said, her voice gentle but firm. I'm not some delicate flower who needs to be sheltered from the reality of who you are. I'm a woman who's spent her career making life and death decisions, who's held dying patients in her arms and fought to save people everyone else had given up on. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her eyes, the determination that had first drawn him to her all those years ago. I'm strong enough to love you, Stephen. All of you. The parts that save the world and the parts that doubt whether you're worthy of being saved. But I need you to trust me with that strength. The soup, forgotten behind them. Stephen pulled her into his arms, holding her against him, as if she might disappear if he let go. I'm terrified, he whispered into her hair. Not of the cosmic threats or the mystical dangers. I'm terrified of being happy, of letting myself have this, have you, when so many people depend on me to sacrifice everything for their safety. Christine's arms tightened around him, her voice muffled against his chest. What if happiness doesn't make you weaker? What if having something to fight for, something to come home to, actually makes you stronger? The question settled into his mind, like a seed finding fertile ground. Stephen thought about the various battles he'd fought, the times he'd pushed himself beyond his limits, and realized that his most desperate, most powerful moments had come not when he was fighting for abstract concepts like justice or duty, but when he was protecting specific people he cared about. Wong, the other sorcerers, Christine herself, in those brief moments when she'd been directly threatened. You might be right, he said slowly, the admission feeling both terrifying and liberating. I usually am, Christine replied, pulling back to look at him with a smile that was equal parts affection and gentle teasing. It's one of my most annoying qualities. Stephen laughed, the sound surprising him with its lightness. I'd forgotten that about you, how you can make me laugh even when I'm being dramatically brooding and self-important. Someone has to keep your ego in check, she said, returning to the stove to rescue their lunch before it burned. Besides, I happen to like your dramatic brooding. It's very mysterious and attractive, but it's also not sustainable 24 hours a day. The normalcy of the moment struck Stephen as almost surreal. Here he was, discussing cosmic responsibility and interdimensional threats while stirring soup in a sunny kitchen. And somehow, it all felt perfectly natural. This was what he'd been missing, he realized. Not just Christine's presence, but her ability to make the extraordinary feel manageable, to ground him in simple human moments that reminded him why protecting the world mattered in the first place. "Can I ask you something?" Christine said, ladling soup into bowls with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. "Anything." She carried the bowls to the small table by the window, settling into her chair before meeting his eyes. "In all those timelines you've seen, all those possible futures, what's the best-case scenario? Not just for us, but for everything. What does victory actually look like?" Stephen considered the question as he joined her at the table, thinking about all the possibilities he'd witnessed, all the potential futures that branched out from every moment. Honestly, the best-case scenarios aren't the ones where I single-handedly defeat every threat. They're the ones where I learn to work with others, where I build a network of people strong enough and trusted enough to share the burden. The afternoon slowly melted into evening, and as the last rays of sunlight painted the apartment in shades of amber and gold, Stephen and Christine remained curled together on the couch, their conversation having drifted into comfortable silence. The weight of the day's revelations settled around them like a warm blanket, not heavy with burden, but rich with possibility. "You know what the real magic is?" Christine whispered, her voice already thick with approaching sleep, her head nestled perfectly in the curve of Stephen's shoulder. "What's that?" he murmured, his own words growing soft and drowsy. "This moment right here, two people choosing each other, choosing to build something together despite all the reasons it should be impossible. That's the kind of magic that changes everything." Stephen smiled in the growing darkness, his hand continuing its gentle rhythm along her back, feeling her breathing slow and deepen as sleep began to claim her. Outside, the city hummed its eternal lullaby, but inside this small apartment, time felt infinite and precious and completely their own. And as they drifted toward sleep together, two souls who had found their way back to each other across impossible distances, Stephen Strange realized that sometimes the greatest adventures weren't about saving the universe. Sometimes they were about learning to save each other, one quiet moment at a time. Sleep well, dear listeners. May your dreams be filled with the kind of love that transcends time and space. And may you wake tomorrow ready to choose magic in all its forms.